Okay, everyone, today we're going to be looking at key concept 4.5, which is energy and matter in an ecosystem. So the sun is the primary source of energy for almost all ecosystems. We use the sun to fuel all of our processes that we use as an organism. So we use the sun to move, grow, function, and reproduce. We don't use the sun directly. We use the energy from the sun, which has been converted into another form that we can then use to fuel our requirements, our energy requirements. So in order to use the sun's energy, we need to transform that energy into another type of energy. And producers, which you should now be familiar with, are the essential organisms that help us convert the sun's energy into a usable form. So they use photosynthesis, which is the conversion of light energy from the sun into chemical energy. So this energy that we get from the sun is never created or stored or destroyed. It is always converted from one form to another. So in photosynthesis, we are converting light energy into chemical energy. So when producers perform photosynthesis, they store light energy as chemical bonds in a molecule called glucose. So glucose is sugar, and we use glucose to fuel all the processes in our bodies. Well, it's one of the main fuel sources anyway. So energy is specifically stored in the bonds between the atoms that make up a molecule of glucose. So glucose is made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. And it's the bonds that hold those atoms together that is the light energy that's stored. So here we have a molecule of glucose. These grey bonds here are where all of that light energy is then converted into a chemical energy form. So this is all chemical energy that was converted from the sun. So we know that in a community we have several trophic levels. Trophic levels refer to levels of energy of consumption. So at the first trophic level, we have our autotrophs, which are the producers of energy. And then we have several trophic levels that include our heterotrophs, and those are the consumers, the organisms that have to consume other organisms to get their energy. And if we have a look at that in producers and consumers, we have producers on the bottom, on the first trophic level, and they convert light energy into chemical energy. And then we have first, second, and third order consumers, which are our heterotrophs, and they have to consume other organisms to get their energy. So as we were talking about before, energy is neither created nor destroyed, it's always transferred from one form to another. Now, when we have energy passing through an ecosystem, not all energy that is trapped by producers is passed on to the next trophic level. So most energy in an organism is used to maintain life processes, and therefore only a small amount of energy is actually passed from one trophic level to the next. In terms of percentages, about 10% of energy is actually transferred from one trophic level to another. Most of the energy that is captured, whether it be by a producer or a consumer, is actually lost as heat through respiration. Respiration is the breakdown of glucose, which is our light energy converted into chemical energy, into carbon dioxide, water, and energy or heat. So it's often a lot of energy is lost through heat. Most energy is not transferred from one trophic level to another. So in this diagram here, we start off with energy that is transferred from one form into another. It's converted from light energy to chemical energy. Now we can see that we have heat loss through respiration because that tree has to live, but the caterpillar is also eating the leaves of the tree. Now that caterpillar only consumes 10% of the available energy that was captured. Now, this caterpillar then also has life processes that it requires, and it uses most of the energy that it gets from the tree to maintain its life. So a lot of energy is lost as heat. So when the bird eats the caterpillar, it only consumes 10% of the energy that the caterpillar has. And then the bird goes through the exact same process. So a lot of energy is lost as heat, and hardly any energy is transferred from one trophic level to another. So here we can see that most energy that is actually transferred onto the surface of the Earth is not captured. Only 2% tends to be captured by producers. So we start out here with our producers, our trophic level 1. Now they have 10,000 units of energy, and only 1,000 of those units is passed on to the second trophic level. So we get a 10% efficiency and a 90% loss. So then if we move up to the next trophic level, those fish that eat those primary consumers only consume 100 units. And then the larger fish that eats the smaller fish only gets 10 units of that energy. So we lose 90% of energy through heat and only maintain 10 through each trophic level. So looking here, there's a lot of energy in producers, but the herbivore only gets 10% of that, and the carnivore only gets 10% of that, and then the top carnivore only gets 10%. So if we start out with a million joules of sunlight, only 10,000 joules of that sunlight is produced or is captured by primary producers, and then only 10% of that is captured by primary consumers, and so on. So it's really important to understand that the sun's energy is not transferred, not all of the energy is transferred through trophic levels, most of it is lost as heat energy. Biogeochemical cycles are incredibly important in ecosystems. We have chemical elements and nutrients that are needed by organisms. And for those nutrients to be available to an ecosystem, again, they have to be cycled. So, like energy, matter is neither created nor destroyed and must be recycled in an ecosystem to become available again. So, we're going to be looking at some chemical elements that are essential in an ecosystem and how they're cycled through an ecosystem. So, firstly, when we say recycling of nutrients through an ecosystem, decomposers are absolutely essential to this process. They feed on the dead and decaying material of organisms, and they break down that organic material so it can be returned to the environment and be taken up by producers, and then go all the way through the ecosystem, only to then come back to the decomposers at the end. So the first cycle that we're going to look at is the water cycle. We all know that water is essential for life on Earth. If we didn't have water, then we wouldn't be here. So there are several processes within the water cycle that you need to be familiar with. You need to understand that water is taken up by plants and by animals. It's then evaporated on surface water like lakes and oceans. It's then also You also get transpiration through plants, which is where water is evaporated into the atmosphere. We also have condensation, which is the formation of clouds. If we then also get precipitation, which is the transfer of water from one phase into another in the form of rain. We then also have melting of water in from being a solid into a liquid, and then we have a runoff of that water down into bodies of water like lakes and oceans. So this whole cycle recycles the water from one phase to another, from one reservoir to another, and is incredibly important in an ecosystem. The carbon cycle is the next cycle that we're going to focus on. So we start firstly at atmospheric carbon dioxide. This atmospheric carbon dioxide is converted from one form into another. it's converted into carbohydrates, which are glucose, via photosynthesis. So plants are incredibly important. They take light energy, convert it into another form, and they take atmospheric carbon dioxide and convert that into a usable form as well. So eventually these carbohydrates are respired through cellular respiration, which I talked about before, and they again form atmospheric CO2. So we have a link between the making of carbohydrates and the consumption of carbohydrates. So carbon dioxide is either transferred through trophic levels through the movement of glucose, or it's released through cellular respiration. When an organism dies, any carbon that it has in its body is broken down, or any organic material is broken down by decomposers. Decomposers respire, meaning that they produce more carbon dioxide. Now, the other source of carbon that we have that we are producing into the atmosphere is fossil fuels. So carbon is stored as the remains of million-year-old organisms, which form coal, gas, and oil. We burn these fuels to provide us with energy. And since we've been doing this in the 20th century, there has been a steady increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. If we have a look back 400,000 years ago, we have cycles of carbon dioxide levels, and then we have basically the hit of the Industrial Revolution around here, and we see a giant spike in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So this is what we call an anthropogenic change to the atmosphere, anthropogenic meaning humans. So we are impacting on the composition of the atmosphere. And as a result, we're impacting the conditions, the climate of the Earth, and that's called climate change. So here again in our carbon cycle, we have our different carbon stores. The atmosphere is a really big one. We have our vegetation and our soil and organic matter, and the ocean actually stores carbon dioxide as well. And then we have all the processes that either release or trap carbon dioxide. We have our respiration of organisms that releases atmospheric carbon dioxide. We have burning of fossil fuels and trees that release carbon dioxide. We have photosynthesis that traps atmospheric carbon dioxide. We also have sedimentary rocks that trap organic material that turn into coal and oil and gas that then are burnt as fossil fuels. The next cycle is the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is really important because it's found in both protein and nucleic acids, and they are essential materials in our bodies that we need. So nitrogen is very abundant in the atmosphere, but it is in a form that that plants cannot use. So there are several ways in which we can convert this unusable nitrogen into a usable form. Some bacteria can actually convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates, which can be used by plants. And we also have some plants that have little nitrogen fixing nodules on their root systems, and they convert atmospheric nitrogen into a usable form for plants. And again, decomposers are very important in the nitrogen cycle because they decompose and break down nitrogen into ammonium, which is available for plants to use. So not all plants will get their nitrogen from nitrogen-fixing bacteria or nitrogen-fixing nodules. They can get it from decomposers in the form of ammonium. There are also some other bacteria that can convert nitrates to nitrogen gas, which means that we bring nitrates or nitrogen back into the atmosphere. If we only had the use of nitrogen fixing bacteria to take nitrogen from the atmosphere, we would deplete it. So we need that cycle to come full circle to make sure that everything is balanced. So again, here is our nitrogen cycle. We have nitrogen in the atmosphere, which can be fixed by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. We then have free nitrates and nitrites and ammonia, which can be taken up by plants. The plants are then eaten by the organisms then excrete or die, and that decaying organic material is then converted into ammonium by decomposers. And we also have our nitrogen or denitrifying bacteria, which puts nitrogen back into the atmosphere. Without that, the cycle would only go one way. The last cycle that we're going to look at is the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is used in nucleic acids as well as RNA and DNA. Again, very important. There is really only one main source of phosphorus on the Earth, which is through rocks that contain phosphorus. So going back to your middle school science, when you learnt about rocks, chemical weathering is the process where a rock is weathered chemically, meaning it is broken down into its elemental composition. So rocks containing phosphorus are chemically weathered down to release that phosphorus, which dissolves into water. That phosphorus in solution is then available to any organisms that require it. And because phosphorus is such a scarce resource, organisms are very well adapted in extracting phosphorus from its solution. And again, decomposers are very important in returning phosphate back into the ecosystem. They take phosphate from dead organisms and return it to the soil. These little pink slugs here are from an extinct volcano in Narrabri, New South Wales. They were on the radio only last week. They don't really look like something you've probably ever seen before, but that's Australian wildlife for you. So again, here's our phosphorus cycle. We have weathering and of rocks that create phosphorus in solution, which is then taken up by plants, which is then, if they die, can be decomposed by organisms. So humans can interfere with natural cycles. In the water cycle, they can remove large quantities of fresh water for irrigation, which impacts how much water is then evaporated back into the atmosphere. They can also release pollutants that can impact on how much water is available. If you have large deforestation, this reduces the amount of transpiration, which means we have a loss of water vapor, which can actually impact on precipitation in the environment. We can also have an increase in surface temperature, which is going to increase evaporation as well. In terms of humans' interference on the carbon cycle, the main one is burning of fossil fuels, which is as a result resulting in climate change and deforestation as well. So this is the Amazon down here. This is a 10-kilometer scale. So you can see how much deforestation has gone into the Amazon, which is reducing organisms or the plants that used to live here, their ability to trap carbon dioxide as glucose. So humans can also interfere with the nitrogen cycle. If you use nitrogen-based fertilizers, it can increase a runoff of nitrogen into water. If you actually burn fossil fuels, you create nitrogen gases into the atmosphere, which is also contributing to climate change. And we also have agricultural processes. So using nitrogen fixing crops creates more nitrogen fixed in a usable form, reducing the amount of atmospheric nitrogen. The use of fertilizers, like these ones above, have been associated with algal blooms in these two pictures here, and they have devastating effects on aquatic ecosystems if they continue. And humans' interference on the phosphorus cycle is very similar as well. It can also result in more phosphorus in water aquatic environments, which results in a process called eutrophication. So this is an algal bloom. What happens is you get runoff of nitrates and phosphates into the water. This increase in nutrients promotes algal growth. Algae needs oxygen to grow, which means it depletes the oxygen levels in the water. It also blocks the sunlight, which means that any plants living on the bottom of this body of water tend to die. Then, when you get things that organisms that do start dying, The decomposers then start breaking those organisms down, and decomposers need oxygen to do that, which further depletes the oxygen levels. So if the oxygen levels become so depleted, all plants and animals in a body of water will die. And at this point, the ecosystem is dead. So this can be a very serious issue. So to tie that all together into what you should have learned about this week, it's looking at the biotic and abiotic components of an ecosystem to capture, transform, and transfer energy. So the abiotic components in this case is the sunlight. The biotic components are the producers. The consumers are also another biotic component that transfers energy from one trophic level to another. Looking at nutrients within an ecosystem and how they are involved in cycles. So we know that nutrients can be transferred through an ecosystem, that decomposers are very important in returning those nutrients through back to the ecosystem to then be cycled through again. And we also now know, and you can give examples of, how humans can interfere with the natural cycles.